Okay, so in this breakout session, I want to talk a little about getting a farm-to-school garden started and some ideas or tips for doing that. So what you'll want to do is kill the existing grass or turf somehow. And as I'd mentioned, there are different ways of doing it, covering with a tarp or initial tittling, or just cutting loose the sod with a shovel or with a sod remover. But once it's tilled, then ideally what you want to do is bring on 4 inches of compost. This would be high carbon compost. A lot of local environmental centers would have a product that should work, and get it delivered directly to the garden and put it on the surface. And so you can see here is we have a bed that I just covered, but there's a deep layer of compost here. And this hasn't been tilled in 4 years, but it's still loose enough to grow crops. And there's long-term fertility in here, which is why I like that system. And there's just great tilth. It's just fun to work with. And when you have higher nutrient soils, there's, generally speaking, less weed pressure too. That's not always the case, and weeds will find a way into any soil that exists. But it's a great way to get started on the right foot, to make sure you have plenty of minerals for your plants in the garden long term. I would recommend staking out the corners, the 4 corners of your plot, and then have a system where you're growing on beds instead of rows. Okay, so if you see the garden here, our beds happen to be 42 inches across the top and then 12 inches between. Now you can choose different widths. 30 inches is a common width. That's one that a lot of kids could step across or straddle, for instance. It's best to keep foot traffic to a minimum inside of a bed if you can. Adults, 42 inches can usually straddle, and so that's why we chose it for production purposes here. And 12 inches is plenty of room that a person and kids can be walking up and down the paths. Okay, to shape these beds, all you really need is a shovel. We take a shovel and simply grade the paths here just to mark the definition. We're not creating raised beds here. It's not a real labor-intensive way to start a garden. This is a minimalist approach, but it's effective for long term, and we're running our business off of that system. Once the initial 4 inches have been placed on the garden, to keep the microbiological activity high, we simply add another inch of compost at the end of the growing season using carts and shovels. So again, low tech, simple, and kids can get involved in that too. So during the season, however, so here's the challenge, is that you're done with a lettuce crop or a cilantro crop or a basil crop. Well, what do? How do you get that crop removed and get the next crop put in? And this is a challenge because there are a lot of different options, and you can spend a lot of time and labor on it. We've found that the simplest is to use what we call 2-step bed flipping. Step number 1 being that we take a tarp and simply smother the old crop. Okay, and so we've done that here with a silage tarp. This is not a sheet of plastic per se. This is a standard sheet of plastic. This is pretty tough stuff that's thick, and it's designed for the silage industry. So you drive around the countryside and you see large heaps of silage being covered with to create an anaerobic atmosphere in there and keep the rain off it. So these are agricultural tarps. They last a long time. Ours have had in season for more than 10 years, and they're still going. So it is plastic, and we want to minimize use of plastics, but if you buy one that's thick enough, that's designed with UV protection, that's for this purpose, then you do get lots of mileage out of them. So it's a great way to take care of an area that's gone to weeds too. If you've if you've gone on vacation, come home and oh shoot, your crop's all covered. Well, just smother the whole area for a couple weeks in the summer, and let me show you what you get. So this is a tall crop here. We had a broccoli crop. Broccoli or cabbage, I can't quite remember. We had a tall brassica crop. that was in here. And what's happened is that silage tarp has done its work in a couple weeks' time, has really melted the crop. A couple of pointers. One of the reasons we like this system is that it's of course lower labor than tilling and owning a tiller and managing the tiller. But also that we're feeding the ground for the next crop. Okay, so the roots have stayed in the ground, and these roots are decomposing under here. And what they're doing is, as they decompose, they're leaving air pockets that keep the soil loose. So without tilling, the ground has stayed fairly loose. Certainly loose enough to get another crop in here without tilling or broad forking or that sort of thing. And then what will, so the way it works is that we're feeding microbials with decomposed old matter, but those microbials need some water too. And you don't want to put a tarp down on dry ground and walk away from it, because that tarp does keep water from the ground, okay? And you need 60% moisture is the optimum amount of moisture in the ground for optimum activity, most of the microbials that we're wanting to encourage here. So 60% is an amount you can grab it with a hand, and it's going to basically hold its shape. Okay, so you can see my fingerprints in here, and that's generally what you want. If you grab it and you, with a bit of a squeeze, and water starts dripping out of here, it's probably too moist, and you'll have an anaerobic environment that is not optimum for those microbials or for plants. So that's the simple test. You can also do what we call a knuckle test, and this would be true throughout the farm. We try to, like within the cilantro, to know that these cilantro roots have the moisture they need, we'll stick a finger in, and I want to feel that there's moisture at my tip when my finger is in down to the knuckle. Does that make sense? It's fine to see a bit of dry soil on the surface. In fact, that makes it easier to do cultivation. However, so we don't need to be running overhead irrigation all the time. But once roots are in the ground, their root system is about 2 inches deep a lot of times, and that's where you need the moisture. Anyhow, so all that's to say, we have 2 runs of drip tape irrigation here, and I'll talk a little bit about drip tape in a second, but we keep the ground moist underneath the tarp, especially if it's on for a long time during a dry season. Okay, so what would we do then at this point? We can't plant into this mess here. And like I said, these were very tall crops. There's some woody matter here. So there is a bit of work to be done. And what we do before the next crop would go in, you can unhook this drip tape. And you only see the bigger of the rakes here. So then I like to use this Austrian bed rake here. It does a great job of sort of skimming the surface, and you can pull all this stuff. And we like to keep it in the garden. If tidiness is a concern for you, then you can certainly take it and remove it to an off-site compost. I'll take the other rake here, thanks. But by keeping it in the path here, we're going to feed roots of the cilantro crop here and of the next crop. And I'll tell you what, within a month or two, you won't even know it was here. Nature's decomposers will continue to work on it. And so, in fact, our paths, you don't see debris generally in them now, but there was debris in here, and they'll keep decomposing. And it's a bit of a mulch too, if it's thick enough. So you can see that there were old roots sticking right, and you can see them still sticking up here. For these taller, woodier crops, we'll sometimes come along with a loppers and we'll cut them first. We didn't do that in this case, and so there's some roots sticking up but that's going to be fine. You can certainly plant into this, and there's no reason to whip out a big gas engine tiller and work the ground here. Every time you till 2 inches deep or more, you're just bringing weed seeds up to the surface, and you're burning up carbon that's in the ground. You're disrupting the hypha networks of the fungal networks that are in the ground. Fungi are one of the microbes in here that we really want to encourage for soil structure, because they create these mycorrhizal networks that it's like a house, like framing members of a house, really, and they're what keeps that soil, gives it that spongy texture long term. So if we're tilling, it's like going through a house with a chainsaw in the middle, kind of, and you're ripping it in half, and it's going to crumble on itself. So they're very high fungal networks, high activity of fungal networks in here, in addition to bacteria and other microbials. Now, a question is, when you put these tarps on, doesn't it get too hot and it kills or slows down microbial activity? And certainly that can be a concern. However, the latest research is showing that most of these microbes, if they have what they need, which is, say, lots of carbon and 60% moisture, they can recolonize very, very quickly. Bacteria in 4 hours time can recolonize an area, and the fungal networks take a little bit longer to have active fungal activity, but even those can repopulate very quickly. Protozoa are the same way. So it's fun, though, for kids to see that there are different decomposers at work. Even now, just looking, I see roly-polies on the ground here. I see ants. If we would dig, there are surely worms. And it'd be a fun project to take a square foot of soil and do an audit. Who are nature's decomposers, and look them up. What role do they have in turning a bushy broccoli plant into this? It's talking with someone earlier too about it's always fun to see what's left behind because it's an indicator of health. A crop like this, what's left behind really is fiber, and especially if we're eating the leaves of kale, some of these larger brassicas. We had a Chinese cabbage that last fall we covered, and it looked like someone had chopped a bunch of 8 or 12-inch ropes and left them on the ground here, and all that fiber is going through your gut, through your system, and it's very nutritious, very healthy to be eating. So there's another science lesson in here. If we had covered lettuce or cilantro, we'd have very little fiber left over. So this is another science lesson in here. Okay, so that's basically it. Step number 2 is raking. The 2 rakes I like these low-cost adjustable tine rakes. The Dollar General down the road, to be honest, is where we picked it up. And they're about $7.99, I think we paid, and they last a long time. And they're great because you can adjust the width. You saw how nicely it raked the debris off here. And then for paths, if we're weeding or working in paths and we just want to clean up the paths, we can narrow it to a width that works for paths, for only the paths. And then if we really want to scrunch it up and go right between plants, you can almost use it as a weeder to get between your rows of plants. So low cost, very versatile tool that has worked well in our case. Does anyone have questions on anything I've covered so far?
You won't have any problems with the brassicas coming back when you leave the root in at this stage?
On rare occasions, kale will do that. You can see the full-size kale in the background here. If we would cut it and try to transplant around that, you would see some shoots come up, but no more than, it's not a bother. You can pinch those off, and it hasn't been an issue.
And how long was that covered?
This was, I want to say, 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay.
And certainly after 2 weeks, it would have been finished.
Okay.
Left it covered so we'd have a little demonstration for us here. And the two variables here are the type of crop, the size and weightiness of it, and then the season. And so if it would be, if we're in October, it's going to take probably till Christmas or longer before the decomposers have completed their work. But if it's a cilantro crop, very little structure to the plant, maybe a day or two actually would be sufficient.
Wow, that cilantro looks great.
We're about ready to harvest. Mm-hmm.
I always have a super hard time when it's hot out getting cilantro to grow.
One tip with growing cilantro and lettuce in the heat, and this is kind of an issue for school gardens, and because those are popular crops that would work really well. But one tip is to use shade cloth. And so we just a few days ago transplanted a new lettuce crop here and a new cilantro crop here. So this is no different. We're just 4 weeks further along here. But to keep them under shade for the first 2 to 3 weeks really helps get that plant established and settled in. So the drip tape systems are an excellent way to go for a school garden project because you can set these on timers and you can keep your ground moist all season. And what we prefer are 8-4, they call it, but 8 millimeter thick, 4-inch spacing, emitter spacing. So 8 millimeters is a relatively thick tape that we can use for many growing seasons. You can certainly spend less money on a thinner tape, but it's fractionally more expensive and then it's reusable. Okay, and the 4-inch emitter spacing is important because you can see how tightly spaced our crops are here, and that's going to be a more even spread. And we found on a 30-inch or a 42-inch wide bed system, 2 runs of tape is enough. You really don't need to have any more than that. And especially with a lot of compost, it does a great job of, one of the things I love about compost is it spreads out the moisture in the ground. It's like a sponge almost, and it moves that water around, so it's fairly even. If we had sand here, water would go straight down. So what we like to do too with our drip tapes is have shut-off valves, so that maybe we want to be watering one bed but not the bed next to it. You can simply shut it off here. This is an 1.5 inch main line. For a smaller garden, 1 inch would be sufficient. These are what they call compression fittings. And so all we're doing is pushing this onto that shutoff valve and then tightening with our hands. So there's not a lot of complexity here and not difficult to learn how to do. To attach the shutoff to the main line, there would have been a punch that would have drilled it. You punch a 1/4 inch hole in that main line here, and then that barbed fitting simply pushes in here and you tighten it by hand. Now, it's important to have the right amount of pressure, of course, going into drip tapes. And you can buy pressure reducers, but we prefer just to have shutoffs. You can sort of see it here. Where a garden hose would attach to the main line. These are standard bushings found at any hardware would have. And then we have a brass shutoff valve here that's going to let us adjust the amount of pressure that we want in the system. Essentially, you want it nice and bulged. You want to see moisture coming out of the tapes, but you don't want so much that you're going to start to burst the tape. So you want to be careful about how much pressure is in there. And then the final piece of this is, so there'd be a garden hose, of course, going up to a water hydrant, but then by all means use timers so that you're not having to turn these things on and off by hand. And there are all kinds on the market. Galcon is one that I'd recommend, and the handout shows, I think, a specific product. But I prefer the timers that you can do multiple settings. So we would typically run the drip tapes and any overhead irrigation in the afternoons when it's hottest. And this would be at noon, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 6 o'clock is what we have right now. And we'll just do even 10 minutes of each of those. Then you have 40 minutes of irrigation during the hottest part of the day when plants are wanting to have a drink. It spreads out, and it helps the compost to spread out that moisture too. Every day in the summer when it's hot, if we have, of course, a week of rain, rainy weather, use that knuckle test. Any day we're not seeing moisture beyond on my fingertip, then yeah, we'll run it. The same is true in the high tunnels, same system. Drip tape's nice, but it's fairly critical to have the ability to do overhead watering too. And let me show you two options for that. I've got my tool back here. So especially for direct seeding a crop, it's really optimum to have one of these watering wands. And Dram is the company making this one here that's worked for us. And then we can easily water in crops just right where the seeds went in the ground. So we don't have to run overhead irrigation on everything. Okay, so even green bean plantings or lettuce or fall brassicas, it doesn't matter. Typically for direct seeding, we're going to water in by hand. And then second, on occasion, we don't use them very often, but we do have the option of running overhead irrigation. And we like to use the Orbits wobbler heads, and y'all are probably familiar with this product. However, these are low cost, and they're probably one-time investments. I mean, I bought these probably 16 years ago when we started farming, and they're still going. And the way these work is it's going to fling water around in a circular fashion here, and it just has one part. So it's not like these old rain birds that go and they break all the time. So these will last a long time. There are different fittings with different orifice sizes that you can change them out. And we found that the lavender fitting is the best. Basically, if you go with a fitting with a large orifice, you've got large droplets coming out of here, and you can disrupt the seeds that you just put in the ground, if that makes sense. If you have a tiny orifice, you're throwing mist in the air and you're losing it, especially on hot afternoons. So you want to split the difference in there.
And is that's hooked up to a separate?
So this is hooked up, that's right. It's not tied into the main line that our drip tape is in. The hose goes to the water hydrant, but there's a divider on that water hydrant. So we can control this completely separately from the drip tape.
Overhead.
That's a good question. So she asked, when would we be using the overhead versus the drip tape? And we have found that in the springtime, especially when we're not losing a lot of water to evaporative, there's not a lot of evaporative water loss. It's nice to settle in crops in the spring to keep the soil surface moist when the roots are very near the surface. And the drip tape, you'd have to run those for a long time to really spread out the water. And then the other one is on really hot afternoons in July and August to just cool the whole garden down, to run these for even 5 minutes at noon, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Even for 5 or 10 minutes, we're not necessarily irrigating, but we're air conditioning. And we have found that the cilantro, that's another tip on the cilantro. So it's cilantro and these lettuces that you're not supposed to be able to grow in July and August, that we can keep them going if we keep them cool in the hottest of the afternoon. Not every afternoon certainly, but the hottest afternoons. This module, I was going to showcase the idea of using landscape fabric with holes drilled into it. And I talked about this in the keynote, but the idea here is if you can step around, and I'll show you two crops we're doing this system with. You see tomatoes, and we've got landscape fabric on the ground here, and we've got drip tape, just like I showed you, going on either side of the tomatoes. But the landscape fabric here, and again, buy the thickest that you can afford so you can use it for multiple seasons. The landscape fabric is doing a couple of things for us. First, it's going to make sure there's no weeds under here. And second, it's going to keep moisture in the ground, so it acts as a bit of a mulch. And what we do is we'll pin it with landscape staples. Sometimes these are called sod staples. And you see I had to walk back about 6 or 8 feet to get to it. You don't need lots. You don't need to pin this down every 6 inches. It depends how windy it is, especially in the greenhouse. There's no wind in here, but in the field even we would not go any closer than 6 or 8 feet apart with these. And then the Farmer's Friend is one place online where you can purchase landscape fabric with holes already drilled into it, or already burned into it. You can use burner torches and burn your own holes too, of course. But here we have tomatoes at about every 18 inches apart. So we have holes about 4 inches in diameter every 18 inches for tomatoes. We have one tarp that we have a couple rows, and step over here you can see the kale, and we've got a couple rows, and those holes are 18 inches, but there are 2 rows on the tarp. So that works nicely with kale, with broccoli, and Farmer's Friend has a handy chart where they suggest 4 different configurations and different crops that fit that spacing. So it's worked well for us. It's a wonderful way to simplify the garden, simplify your planning, and it's a way to know that your students are transplanting at the proper spacing too. No need for measuring tapes.